The keycard trembled in my hand as I stood outside room 1247 at the Sterling Grand Hotel. Through the thick mahogany door, I could hear my sister Tori sobbing, raw, desperate sounds that made my chest tighten. She'd been missing for 3 days. 3 days of calling hospitals, filing police reports, and watching my husband Marcus act like everything was perfectly normal. But now, as I pressed my ear against the cold wood, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Tori's voice, weak and scared, saying, "Please, I promise I won't tell anyone about the accounts. Just let me go home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." The whole thing started innocently enough, the way most nightmares do. It was a Tuesday morning in early October, and Portland's autumn rain was painting streaks down the windows of my downtown office. I was reviewing campaign proposals for a new luxury hotel chain when Tori burst through my door, her cheeks flushed from running and her dark hair sticking to her forehead. "Cass, I need to talk to you," she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder before closing the door behind her. "It's about Marcus." I looked up from my laptop, immediately concerned. Tori had always been cautious around my husband, polite but distant. In the 2 years Marcus and I had been married, I'd attributed her reserve to typical sister protectiveness. She was 4 years younger than me, fresh out of college, and still adjusting to having a brother-in-law in our tight family unit. "What about Marcus?" I asked, setting down my coffee cup. Tori perched on the edge of the chair across from my desk, her fingers twisting the strap of her messenger bag. "I saw him yesterday at Pioneer Square. He was with this woman, Elena something. They were arguing about money, and I heard your name." My stomach dropped slightly, but I kept my expression neutral. Marcus had mentioned Elena Vasquez before. She was his business partner's investment broker, someone who helped finance his real estate deals. Arguing how? She kept saying something about the Hartwell accounts and how you were becoming a problem. Marcus looked really angry, Cass. Like, angrier than I've ever seen him. Tori's voice dropped to almost a whisper. And then Elena saw me watching from across the square. She pointed me out to Marcus, and they both stared at me for like 30 seconds before I walked away. I leaned back in my chair, processing this information. The Hartwell accounts, that had to refer to the business accounts for my marketing agency, the company our father had built from nothing and left to me when he and Mom died in that car accident 3 years ago. Marcus knew I was protective of the business, that it was the last connection I had to our parents and the only source of financial security for both Tori and me. "Maybe it was just business talk," I said, though something cold was settling in my chest. "You know how intense real estate deals can get." Tori shook her head emphatically. "No, Cass, this felt different. The way they were looking at me afterwards. I got the feeling I wasn't supposed to hear whatever they were discussing." I studied my sister's face. Tori had always been perceptive, the kind of person who noticed when the grocery store clerk was having a bad day or when our neighbor's dog seemed sick. She'd inherited our mother's intuition, the same instinct that had helped Mom build lasting relationships with every client she'd ever worked with. "What exactly did you hear Elena say?" I asked. "Something about quarterly transfers and creative accounting. She mentioned a deadline too. Something about October 15th. Tori's brow furrowed as she tried to remember. "And Marcus said something about how you trust too easily and wouldn't question the right signatures." The coffee in my stomach turned acidic. October 15th was next week, and it was also when I typically reviewed our quarterly financial statements. Marcus had been encouraging me to let him help with the business finances lately, suggesting I was taking on too much stress managing both the creative and financial sides of the agency. "Did they see you leave?" I asked. "I don't think so. I ducked into Powell's books and waited there for like an hour before heading home." Tori hesitated, then added, "Cass, there's something else." When I got back to the apartment, Marcus was already there. He said he'd been home all afternoon working on proposals, but I know I saw him downtown. I felt that familiar protective instinct kick in, the same feeling I'd had when Tori was little and would come to me crying about schoolyard bullies. After our parents died, I'd become more than just her big sister. I was her guardian, her safety net, the person responsible for making sure she finished college and had a secure future. "Listen," I said, reaching across the desk to squeeze her hand. "I'll look into this, okay? But in the meantime, maybe stay away from downtown for a few days. If they're involved in something shady, I don't want you accidentally overhearing more than you should." Tori nodded, but I could see the worry lines creasing her forehead. "Promise me you'll be careful?" "I know you love Marcus, but something about this whole thing feels wrong." After she left, I sat alone in my office for a long time, staring at the rain-soaked city beyond my windows. The Sterling Grand Hotel rose like a glass and steel monument 12 blocks away, its upper floors disappearing into the low-hanging clouds. I'd done marketing work for them 6 months ago, a campaign that had helped boost their occupancy rates by 30%. The general manager, Mrs. Caldwell, had been so pleased she'd offered to provide references for any future hospitality clients I wanted to pursue. That evening, I arrived home to find Marcus in the kitchen, humming while he chopped vegetables for dinner. Our house in the Pearl District was a restored Victorian that we'd bought together the previous year, using the profits from one of his real estate flips as a down payment. It was beautiful. Hardwood floors, original crown molding, a kitchen Marcus had renovated himself. But suddenly it felt different, like I was seeing it through new eyes. "Hey, beautiful," he said, kissing my cheek as I set down my bag. "How was your day?" "Busy," I replied, watching his face carefully. "Tori stopped by the office earlier. She mentioned seeing you downtown yesterday." Marcus's knife paused for just a fraction of a second before resuming its steady rhythm. "Downtown? Yesterday?" "No, I was here all afternoon working on the Morrison Street project." The lie came so easily, so smoothly, that I almost doubted what Tori had told me. But I'd learned to trust my sister's observations, especially when it came to reading people and situations. "She must have been mistaken then," I said lightly. "You know how she is. Always thinks she sees people she knows everywhere." Marcus laughed, but it sounded forced. "Remember when she thought she saw Mom at the grocery store last year? Poor kid's still processing the grief differently than we are." I nodded and moved to the refrigerator to pour myself a glass of wine, using the movement to hide my expression. Bringing up our mother's death was a low blow, a way to deflect from the conversation by making me feel guilty for questioning him. It was subtle manipulation, the kind I might not have noticed if I hadn't been specifically watching for it. During dinner, Marcus was charming and attentive, asking about my current projects and sharing funny stories about his difficult clients. But I found myself studying him in a way I hadn't since we first started dating. The way his eyes didn't quite meet mine when he laughed. How he kept checking his phone between courses, claiming it was work emails but never showing me the screen. The slight tension in his shoulders that suggested he was working harder than usual to appear relaxed. After he went to bed, I sat in my home office reviewing the business financial statements from the past 6 months. Everything appeared normal on the surface. Client payments, vendor expenses, employee salaries, quarterly tax deposits. But as I dug deeper, I started noticing irregularities that made my skin crawl. 3 separate deposits had been made to our operating account in amounts just under $10,000 each, all from something called DV Consulting Services. I'd never heard of this company, and the deposits weren't tied to any client work I could identify. When I tried to research DV Consulting online, I found nothing. No website, no business registration, no trace of the company's existence. More troubling were the automatic transfers that had been set up from our savings account to a business account I didn't recognize. $5,000 had been moving out of our reserves every month for the past 4 months, labeled as loan payments in our banking software. But I'd never authorized any business loans, and Marcus had never mentioned borrowing money for his real estate projects. I pulled out the folder containing our business partnership agreement, the document Marcus and I had signed when we got married to clarify how my inherited business would be managed within our marriage.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Reading through the legal language with fresh eyes, I noticed clauses I'd glossed over 2 years ago. provisions that gave Marcus significant authority to make financial decisions in the best interest of business continuity and growth. My father had always warned me about mixing business with marriage. "Keep your finances clear and separate," he'd said during one of our last conversations before the accident. "Love and money don't always want the same things, sweetheart. Make sure you know which one you're choosing in any given moment." At the time, I'd thought he was being overly cautious. Marcus had never shown any interest in controlling my business. In fact, he'd encouraged me to expand and take on bigger clients. But now I was wondering if that encouragement had been strategic, rather than supportive. The next morning, I called Dr. Patricia Nguyen, my former psychology professor, and the closest thing I had to a mentor since my parents died. Patricia had known my family for years and had helped me navigate the emotional challenges of inheriting a business while grieving the loss of both parents. "I need advice," I said when she answered her phone, "but I need to know it stays between us." "Of course," Patricia replied without hesitation. "What's troubling you?" I explained what Tori had witnessed and what I'd discovered in the financial records, careful to stick to facts rather than assumptions. Patricia listened without interrupting, asking only clarifying questions about specific details. "Cassandra," she said when I finished, "what you're describing sounds like a pattern of financial manipulation. The timing is particularly concerning. These irregularities started right around the time you signed that business partnership agreement." "But Marcus loves me," I said, hating how desperate the words sounded. "We built this life together. Why would he want to hurt me financially?" "Love and exploitation aren't mutually exclusive," Patricia said gently. "People can genuinely care about someone while still prioritizing their own interests. The question you need to ask yourself is whether Marcus fell in love with you or with what you represented: financial security, business connections, social status." I spent the rest of the day thinking about Patricia's words while mechanically going through my work routine. Client calls, campaign reviews, budget approvals. All the tasks that had felt meaningful and purposeful just days ago now seemed distant and unreal. I kept coming back to small moments from our relationship that I'd interpreted as romantic but could also be seen as calculating. The way Marcus had insisted on a short engagement, saying he didn't want to waste time with elaborate planning when we both knew we wanted to be together. How he'd suggested combining our bank accounts for simplicity, just weeks after our wedding. His enthusiasm for taking over the business's financial management, presenting it as a way to reduce my stress rather than increase his control. That evening, Tori didn't come home. She'd texted around 6, saying she was staying at her friend Lisa's apartment to work on a group project, which wasn't unusual. She often spent nights at various friends' places, especially when deadlines were approaching. But something about the timing made me uneasy. I tried calling her around 10 o'clock, but the call went straight to voicemail. When I texted asking if everything was okay, I got no response. Marcus was working late again, allegedly meeting with a contractor about a property renovation, so I was alone in the house with my growing anxiety. By midnight, I was genuinely worried. Tori always answered her phone even when she was busy or upset with me. The longest she'd ever gone without responding to a text was maybe 2 hours. I called Lisa's number, which I had saved from previous emergencies. "Oh, hey, Cass," Lisa said, sounding confused. "No, Tori's not here." She texted me this afternoon asking if she could use my name if anyone asked where she was, but she said it was some kind of family surprise thing. I figured it had to do with your anniversary or something. My blood turned to ice water. Our wedding anniversary wasn't for another 6 months, and Tori would never lie about her whereabouts for something like party planning. She was terrible at keeping secrets, especially happy ones. "Did she say anything else?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just that she might need me to cover for her for a couple days. She seemed really nervous, which I thought was weird. But you know Tori. She gets anxious about surprising people." After hanging up, I sat on our living room couch trying to make sense of the situation. Tori had lied about where she was going. She wasn't answering her phone. She'd asked a friend to provide her with an alibi. And this had happened just one day after she'd overheard Marcus and Elena discussing something they clearly wanted to keep secret. I called the police, But they wouldn't take a missing person report for an adult who'd been gone less than 24 hours, especially when she'd told friends she was going somewhere voluntarily. The officer I spoke with was polite but dismissive, suggesting that college-aged kids often went off on spontaneous trips without telling their families. Marcus came home around 1 in the morning, his clothes smelling like sawdust, and his hands stained with what looked like wood stain. He seemed genuinely surprised when I told him Tori was missing, immediately offering to help search for her and suggesting we call everyone in her contact list. But I noticed he didn't seem particularly worried. When I mentioned that her friend Lisa had no idea where she was, Marcus just shrugged and said, "You know how college kids are. She probably met some guy and decided to have an adventure. She'll turn up in a day or two with a great story and a hangover." The casual dismissal of my concern felt wrong. Marcus knew how close Tori and I were, how responsible she was, how unlikely it would be for her to disappear without explanation. His lack of genuine worry suggested either he knew something I didn't, or he cared less about my sister's well-being than I'd always assumed. The next morning brought no word from Tori. I spent the day calling her professors, her classmates, even the campus health center, but no one had seen or heard from her since Tuesday afternoon. I filed the missing person report as soon as the 24-hour period had elapsed, giving the police her photo, her physical description, and a detailed timeline of her last known activities. Detective Morrison, the officer assigned to her case, took more notes than his colleague had the night before, but I could tell he was still skeptical about the urgency of the situation. "College students go missing more often than you'd think," he said, closing his notepad. 90% of the time, they show up within a week with a reasonable explanation. "We'll put out a BOLO alert and check with local hospitals, but honestly, Mrs. Donovan, I expect she'll call you herself before we find anything." I wanted to tell him about Marcus's strange behavior, about the overheard conversation with Elena, about the financial irregularities I'd discovered. But, without more concrete evidence, I knew I'd sound like a paranoid wife looking for someone to blame for her sister's choices. Instead, I decided to start my own investigation. If Marcus was involved in something that had motivated Tori to disappear, I needed to understand what it was and how dangerous it might be. And if my sister was in trouble, I wasn't going to wait for the police to prioritize her case. That afternoon, I drove to Pioneer Courthouse Square and spent 2 hours sitting on the same bench where Tori said she'd witnessed the argument between Marcus and Elena. It was a long shot, but I hoped to catch sight of Elena or overhear some information that might help me understand what they'd been discussing. I didn't see Elena, but I did notice something interesting. Marcus's business partner, Derek Yamamoto, was having lunch at a nearby cafe with a woman I didn't recognize. They were sitting close together, speaking in low voices, and Derek kept glancing around nervously, as if he was worried about being overheard. I positioned myself at a table within earshot, ordering coffee and pretending to work on my laptop while straining to catch fragments of their conversation. Most of what I heard was too quiet or too scattered to make sense of, but I did catch a few phrases that made my pulse quicken. "The sister knows something," the woman said at one point. "Elena's handling it," Derek replied. "But we need to move faster on the other thing. How much longer can we keep her contained?" Quote, "As long as necessary." Marcus says his wife won't question anything for at least another week. I nearly dropped my coffee cup. They were talking about containing someone, and given the context, that someone was almost certainly Tori, which meant she wasn't missing by choice. She was being held somewhere against her will. I forced myself to remain calm, to keep typing meaningless words on my laptop screen while my mind raced through the implications. Marcus was involved in keeping my sister in prison somewhere. His business partner Derek was part of it. And Elena, whoever she was apparently the person in charge of the operation. The woman at Derek's table stood up first, dropping a $20 bill beside her untouched salad. As she walked past my table, I got a clear look at her face. Sharp cheekbones, dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, expensive suit that screamed corporate power. She moved like someone accustomed to being in control, confident and purposeful. Derek left a few minutes later, but not before making a phone call that I managed to partially overhear. "Yes, it's confirmed," he said. The timeline is still viable. Just make sure there are no complications before Friday. Friday was tomorrow. Whatever they were planning, it was happening soon. I sat alone at the cafe for another hour, trying to piece together what I'd learned. Marcus and his associates were holding Tori somewhere, probably to prevent her from sharing whatever she'd overheard about their financial scheme. They had a specific timeline they were working toward, with Friday marking some kind of deadline, and they believed I was too trusting or naive to figure out what was happening. That last assumption was going to be their biggest mistake. When I got home, Marcus was in the kitchen again, but this time he wasn't cooking. He was on the phone, speaking in a low voice with his back turned toward the door. I heard him say, "No, she's not suspicious yet. I can probably buy us another few days if needed." I quietly backed out of the kitchen and went upstairs to our bedroom, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he'd be able to hear it from 2 floors away. Marcus was actively working to keep me from discovering the truth about Tori's disappearance. He was lying to me, manipulating me, and participating in what amounted to kidnapping my sister. But he'd also just given me valuable information. They thought I was still clueless, which meant I had the advantage of being underestimated. If I could maintain the pretense of ignorance while gathering evidence and locating Tori, I might be able to save her and expose whatever scheme they were running. I spent that evening acting as normal as possible, sharing dinner with Marcus and letting him comfort me about Tori's absence. When he suggested we go to bed early because I looked exhausted from worry, I agreed readily, even letting him hold me while I pretended to fall asleep. But as soon as his breathing became deep and regular, I carefully extracted myself from his arms and crept downstairs to his home office. If Marcus was involved in something criminal, there had to be evidence somewhere in his personal files. His computer was password protected, but I knew Marcus well enough to guess his login credentials on the 3rd try, a combination of his birthday and his mother's maiden name. Once I had access to his email and documents, I started searching for any references to Elena, DV Consulting, or unusual financial transfers. What I found made me sick to my stomach. Email after email documented a complex scheme to systematically drain money from my business accounts and transfer it to offshore holdings controlled by Elena's investment firm. Marcus had been providing her with detailed information about my business operations, my client relationships, and my personal financial habits. The plan was to gradually siphon enough money to fund several real estate projects, with profits being split between Marcus, Derek, and Elena. But the most devastating discovery was a series of text messages between Marcus and Elena from the past 3 days. The thread started with Elena writing, "The sister overhead us. She needs to be managed until after the final transfer." Marcus had responded, "I can handle Cass, but Tori is a problem. She won't stay quiet if she thinks her sister is being robbed." "Then we make sure she can't talk to anyone," Elena had replied. "I have a place we can keep her for a few days. Just long enough to complete the business." The final message in the thread was from earlier that evening. "Package secured at location. Ready for Friday completion." I took screenshots of everything, emailing copies to myself from an account Marcus didn't know I had. Then I carefully logged out of his computer and returned to bed, where I lay awake for the rest of the night planning my next move. Tori was being held somewhere, described as a quote, package, and kept at a location until they could complete their theft of my business assets. Tomorrow was Friday, which meant whatever they were planning would happen in less than 18 hours. I had to find her before then. But I also had to be smart about it. If I confronted Marcus directly or called the police without more evidence, they might move Tori somewhere else or hurt her to keep her quiet. I needed to locate her, gather enough proof to ensure criminal charges would stick, and get my sister to safety without alerting the people holding her. As the first gray light of dawn crept through our bedroom windows, I made my decision. I was going to find Tori, expose the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed my family and my business, and make sure everyone involved faced consequences for their actions. They thought I was just a grieving daughter who'd inherited more than she could handle, a trusting wife who wouldn't question her husband's support, a naive business owner who'd sign whatever papers were put in front of her. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they'd been. The morning air in Portland carried the scent of rain and coffee as I walked through the Pearl District, my phone pressed against my ear while I spoke to Jimmy Sullivan. He was a private investigator Patricia had recommended, a former police detective who specialized in missing persons cases. His voice was gravelly but reassuring. the kind that suggested he'd seen everything and wasn't easily shocked. "Mrs. Donovan, based on what you've told me, this isn't a typical missing person situation," Jimmy said. "If your sister is being held against her will to prevent her from exposing financial crimes, we're dealing with kidnapping charges on top of fraud and theft. But we need to be very careful about how we proceed." I ducked into a small coffee shop on Northwest 23rd, choosing a corner table where I could speak privately. "What do you mean?" "If we move too fast and alert the people holding your sister, they might panic and hurt her. Or they could move her somewhere else, making it even harder to find her. We need to locate her first, gather evidence of the crimes, and then coordinate with law enforcement to ensure her safe recovery." Jimmy explained that he had contacts within the Portland Police Bureau who could help once we had solid evidence, but he cautioned against involving them too early. "Right now, all you have are suspicious financial transactions and some overheard conversations. That's not enough for search warrants or arrests. We need to build a stronger case." "How long do you think that will take?" I asked, watching pedestrians hurry past the coffee shop windows. I found text messages suggesting they're planning to complete whatever they're doing today. "Then we work fast," Jimmy replied. "I'm going to start by running background checks on Elena Vasquez and Derek Yamamoto. I'll also look into any properties they might have access to where they could be holding your sister. In the meantime, I need you to act completely normal around your husband. Don't let him suspect you know anything." After ending the call, I sat alone with my coffee for a long time, trying to process the surreal reality of my situation. 3 days ago, my biggest worry had been whether to expand my marketing agency's service offerings. Now I was coordinating with a private investigator to rescue my sister from kidnappers, one of whom was the man I'd promised to love and honor for the rest of my life. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Hope you're feeling better today. I know you're worried about Tori, but I'm sure she's fine. Love you." The casual tone made my stomach churn. He was texting me about my missing sister while actively participating in keeping her in prison somewhere. The level of deception required to maintain that facade was staggering. I typed back, "Thanks for being so supportive. I don't know what I'd do without you right now." It wasn't entirely a lie. I was learning things about Marcus that I never would have discovered under normal circumstances. His capacity for manipulation, his willingness to harm my family for financial gain, his skill at presenting himself as a loving husband while systematically betraying everything our marriage was supposed to represent. At the office, I threw myself into work with unusual intensity, partly to maintain appearances, and partly because focusing on familiar tasks helped calm my racing thoughts. I reviewed client campaigns, responded to emails, and participated in strategy meetings, all while my mind churned through possibilities for where Tori might be held. Around noon, my assistant knocked on my door with a concerned expression. "Cassandra, there's someone here to see you. She says it's about your sister." My heart rate spiked, but I forced myself to remain calm. "Send her in." The woman who entered my office was the same person I'd seen at the cafe with Derek Yamamoto the day before. Up close, she was even more intimidating. Tall, impeccably dressed, with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of my appearance and demeanor. "Mrs. Donovan," she said, extending a manicured hand. "I'm Elena Vasquez. I believe your husband has mentioned me." I shook her hand, noting how cold her fingers felt despite the warm office temperature. "Of course. You work with Derek on real estate investments." "Among other things," Elena replied, settling into the chair across from my desk without being invited. "I wanted to speak with you about a business opportunity that might interest you. Your marketing agency has quite an impressive reputation." I leaned back in my chair, studying her face for any sign of what she was really thinking. "Thank you. We've worked hard to build strong client relationships." "I'm particularly interested in your client database," Elena continued. "The luxury hotel chains, the high-end restaurants, the exclusive retail boutiques. You've cultivated exactly the kind of upscale market that my investment firm targets." The request was so blatant it almost made me laugh. She wasn't even trying to be subtle about wanting access to my business assets. "I'm afraid our client information is confidential. We have strict privacy agreements with everyone we work with." Elena's smile never wavered, but something shifted in her eyes. Of course. Professional discretion is so important in our line of work. Perhaps we could discuss other forms of collaboration. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder containing what appeared to be a contract. I've prepared a partnership proposal that would allow your agency to expand into larger markets. My firm would provide the capital investment, and you'd maintain creative control while we handle the business development. I accepted the folder but didn't open it. This is very generous, but I'd need time to review any partnership agreements with my attorney. Naturally, Elena said, though I could tell my caution was irritating her. However, I should mention that this opportunity is somewhat time-sensitive. We're looking to finalize partnerships by the end of this week. There it was again. That artificial urgency, the pressure to make quick decisions without proper consideration. It was the same tactic Marcus had used when he'd pushed for our short engagement and immediate financial integration. I appreciate your interest, I said carefully, but I never make major business decisions without thorough review. I'm sure you understand. Elena stood gracefully, but I caught a flash of annoyance before her professional mask slipped back into place. Of course. I'll look forward to hearing from you soon. After she left, I opened the folder and scanned the contract she'd provided. The language was dense and full of legal terminology, but the basic structure was clear. Elena's firm would gain significant control over my business operations, including access to client lists, financial records, and decision-making authority. In exchange, they'd provide funding for expansion that I didn't actually need. It was a sophisticated takeover disguised as a partnership opportunity. If I'd signed it, Elena would have gained legal access to everything she was currently trying to steal through Marcus's financial manipulations. I photographed every page of the contract and emailed the images to Jimmy Sullivan, along with a detailed account of my conversation with Elena. Then I locked the original documents in my office safe, next to the financial records I'd been collecting as evidence. That afternoon, Jimmy called with his initial findings. Elena Vasquez runs a boutique investment firm called Meridian Capital. On paper, everything looks legitimate. Proper business registration, clean financial filings, respectable client references. But when I dug deeper, I found some interesting connections. What kind of connections? Meridian Capital has ties to several real estate development projects that failed under suspicious circumstances. Properties were purchased with investor money, then sold at significant losses to shell companies. The original investors lost their money, but the shell companies were traced back to offshore accounts controlled by Meridian's principals. Jimmy explained that Elena's business model appeared to involve identifying successful small businesses, particularly those owned by people who might be vulnerable to manipulation. She'd establish relationships with key family members or romantic partners, then use those connections to gain access to business assets. Your husband fits the profile perfectly, Jimmy said. Ambitious but not particularly successful on his own, willing to compromise his ethics for financial gain, and married to someone with assets worth stealing. The clinical assessment of my marriage was brutal but accurate. Marcus had never been entirely self-sufficient financially. His real estate ventures generated modest profits, but nothing close to the lifestyle he seemed to want. Marrying me had given him access to social connections, business opportunities, and financial resources that would have taken him years to develop independently. What about properties where they might be holding Tori? I asked. I'm working on that. Elena's firm owns or manages several commercial properties around Portland, including warehouse space and temporary housing facilities. I'm checking each location, but it's going to take time. We might not have much time, I said, explaining about the Friday deadline I'd discovered in Marcus's text messages. Then we need to force their hand, Jimmy replied. I have an idea, but it's going to require you to take some risks. That evening, Marcus came home with flowers and Thai food from my favorite restaurant. He was being extra attentive, asking about my day, and listening with apparent concern as I described my worry about Tori's continued absence. I keep thinking about all the things that could have happened to her, I said, allowing genuine emotion to creep into my voice. What if she's hurt somewhere? What if someone took her? Marcus set down his chopsticks and reached across the table to squeeze my hand. Hey, don't torture yourself with worst-case scenarios. Tori's smart and capable. She can take care of herself. But what if she can't? I pressed. What if she's trapped somewhere and can't call for help? Cass, you're spiraling, Marcus said gently. I know you feel responsible for her because of your parents, but Tori's an adult. She makes her own choices. The ease with which he dismissed my sister's well-being while knowing exactly where she was being held made me want to scream. Instead, I nodded and pretended his words were comforting. You're probably right, I said. I just miss her, you know? We talk every day, and this silence feels so wrong. Marcus continued eating, seemingly satisfied that he'd calmed my concerns. But I noticed he checked his phone several times during dinner, and his responses to my conversation became increasingly distracted. After he went to bed, I implemented the plan Jimmy and I had developed. I sent a carefully crafted email to Elena, expressing interest in her partnership proposal, but requesting additional information about the timeline and financial structure. I've discussed your offer with my business manager, I wrote, and we're intrigued by the expansion possibilities. However, I'd like to understand more about why the partnership needs to be finalized so quickly. Could we schedule a meeting tomorrow to discuss the details? I sent the email at midnight, knowing it would create pressure for Elena to respond quickly, while also suggesting I was seriously considering her proposal. The response came at 6 a.m. I'm delighted by your interest. Unfortunately, I'm traveling today, but perhaps we could meet this evening? I'm staying at the Sterling Grand Hotel downtown. Would 7 o'clock work for you? My blood went cold as I read the message. The Sterling Grand Hotel was where I'd started my story, where I'd found Tori locked in room 1247. Elena was staying at the same hotel where my sister was being held prisoner. I forwarded the email to Jimmy immediately, then called him despite the early hour. This is it, I said when he answered. Elena's at the hotel where Tori is being held. She wants to meet with me tonight. It could be a coincidence, Jimmy cautioned, though his voice suggested he didn't believe it either. Or they're keeping Tori close so they can control the situation if something goes wrong, I replied. Jimmy, what if they're planning to hurt her tonight? What if the Friday deadline means they're going to eliminate the witness after they complete their theft? There was a long pause before Jimmy spoke again. Okay, here's what we're gonna do. I'll position myself at the hotel this afternoon and try to locate your sister. You'll keep your appointment with Elena, but you'll wear a recording device and try to get her to incriminate herself. If we can gather enough evidence of the kidnapping and fraud, we can involve the police and end this tonight. What if something goes wrong? I asked. That's why we're going to have backup plans, Jimmy said. And Cassandra, your sister is lucky to have you fighting for her. The rest of the day passed in a blur of nervous energy and careful preparation. I met with Jimmy at his office, where he fitted me with a tiny recording device disguised as a button on my blazer. We went over the questions I should ask Elena to elicit incriminating responses, and he showed me how to send a panic signal if the situation became dangerous. Remember, Jimmy said as we finalized our plans, your goal is to keep Elena talking long enough for me to locate your sister. Don't take any unnecessary risks, and don't try to confront her about the kidnapping directly. We need her to feel confident and in control. At 6:30, I arrived at the Sterling Grand Hotel. The lobby was elegant and bustling with business travelers and tourists, but I barely noticed the marble columns and crystal chandeliers. Somewhere in this building, Tori was being held against her will, probably terrified and wondering if anyone was looking for her. I approached the front desk and asked to be connected to Elena Vasquez's room. The desk clerk made the call, then handed me the phone. Cassandra? Elena's voice was warm and welcoming. I'm so glad you could make it. I'm in the restaurant on the mezzanine level. Just take the elevator to the second floor. As I rode the elevator up, I tried to calm my racing heart and focus on the task ahead. I needed to appear interested in Elena's business proposal while secretly gathering evidence of her crimes. One wrong word or suspicious reaction could put both Tori and me in danger. The restaurant was dimly lit and half empty, with soft jazz playing in the background. Elena had secured a corner table with a view of the city, and she stood to greet me with the same professional smile she'd worn in my office. You look lovely, she said, gesturing for me to sit across from her. I took the liberty of ordering wine. I hope you don't mind. Not at all, I replied, settling into my chair and activating the recording device with a subtle touch to my blazer button. Elena poured wine from an expensive bottle, talking casually about the restaurant's reputation and the hotel's recent renovations. She seemed completely relaxed, showing no sign that she was involved in kidnapping or fraud. Now then, she said, raising her glass in a toast, to new partnerships and profitable ventures. I clinked my glass against hers, then took a small sip while Elena drank more generously. I have to admit, I'm curious about the urgency surrounding this partnership. Most business deals take weeks or months to finalize. Elena's expression remained pleasant, but I noticed her grip tighten slightly on her wine glass. In my experience, the best opportunities require quick decisions. When you hesitate too long, someone else steps in and claims what could have been yours. That makes sense from an investment perspective, I said carefully. But from my end, I'm responsible for protecting my employees and my clients. My father always taught me to be cautious with the business he built. Your father was undoubtedly a wise man, Elena replied. But sometimes wisdom can become paralysis. You have to know when to trust your instincts and take calculated risks. She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a more intimate tone. Cassandra, may I speak frankly? Your business has tremendous potential, but you're limiting yourself by trying to maintain such tight control over every aspect. With the right partnership, you could expand into markets you've never imagined. What kind of markets? I asked. Elena's eyes lit up with enthusiasm that seemed genuine. International luxury brands, European hotel chains, Asian investment firms. I have connections throughout the global marketplace that could transform your little Portland agency into an international operation. The way she said little Portland agency carried just a hint of condescension, suggesting she viewed my business as quaint and provincial rather than successful and established. That sounds ambitious, I said. But international expansion would require significant capital investment and operational changes. I'd need to understand exactly what your firm would expect in return. Naturally, Elena said, refilling both our glasses. Full transparency is essential for successful partnerships. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a more detailed contract than the one she'd shown me that morning. This outlines the complete structure of our proposed collaboration. You'll see that we're offering very generous terms. I accepted the document and began scanning the pages, noting clauses that would give Elena's firm access to my client database, financial records, and operational procedures. It was essentially a complete takeover disguised as a partnership. This is quite comprehensive, I said, looking up to meet her eyes. But I noticed there are several sections that seem to give your firm significant control over my business operations. Elena waved dismissively. Standard protection clauses. When we're investing significant capital, we need assurance that our interests are protected. But you'll maintain complete creative control and day-to-day management authority. It was a lie, and we both knew it. The contract clearly stated that Elena's firm would have veto power over major decisions and access to all business assets. I'm also concerned about this clause regarding existing business relationships, I continued, pointing to a section buried in the middle of the document. It seems to suggest that your firm would gain access to my current client contracts. Only for the purpose of identifying expansion opportunities, Elena said smoothly. We're not interested in stealing your clients, Cassandra. We want to help you serve them better. Another lie. The contract language was clear about transferring client relationships to Elena's management. I set down the document and reached for my wine glass, using the movement to glance around the restaurant. Near the bar, I spotted Jimmy Sullivan pretending to read a newspaper while keeping watch over our table. His presence was reassuring, but I knew I needed to keep Elena talking until he could locate Tori. Elena, can I ask you something personal? I said, leaning forward as if confiding in a friend. How did you get started in investment management? It's such a competitive field. Elena's expression softened slightly, and for a moment she seemed almost human rather than predatory. I started with nothing, she said. My parents were immigrants who worked multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. I learned early that if you want something in this world, You have to be willing to take it. That must have been difficult, I said with genuine sympathy. It was, Elena replied, her voice taking on a harder edge. But it taught me that nice people finish last. Kindness is a luxury that poor people can't afford. There was real bitterness in her words, and I found myself wondering what experiences had shaped her worldview. But then I remembered that this woman was responsible for kidnapping my sister, and any sympathy I felt evaporated. So you believe in doing whatever it takes to succeed? I asked. Elena's smile returned, but it was colder now. I believe in recognizing opportunities and acting decisively. Most people are too sentimental or too fearful to claim what they deserve. Even if it means hurting other people? Business isn't a charity, Cassandra. If someone gets hurt because they were too naive or too trusting to protect themselves, that's not my responsibility. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the restaurant's air conditioning. Elena had just revealed her complete lack of empathy for the people she victimized. In her mind, anyone who trusted the wrong person or failed to anticipate deception deserved whatever happened to them. That's a rather harsh philosophy, I said carefully. It's a realistic philosophy, Elena corrected. The world is full of people who will smile at you while they figure out how to take advantage of you. Better to be the one doing the taking than the one being taken. She drained her wine glass and signaled the waiter for another bottle. But enough about philosophy. Let's talk about practical matters. When can you sign this partnership agreement? I'd need to have my attorney review it first, I said. Probably early next week. Elena's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. I'm afraid that timeline doesn't work for our purposes. As I mentioned, this opportunity is time-sensitive. How time-sensitive? We need your signature tonight. The demand was so abrupt and unreasonable that I almost laughed. Elena, no responsible business owner signs major contracts without legal review. You can't possibly expect me to make a decision of this magnitude in one evening. I can, and I do, Elena said, her friendly facade finally slipping completely. You see, Cassandra, you don't really have a choice in this matter. My heart began racing, but I forced myself to remain calm. What do you mean? Elena reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, swiping to a photo that made my blood freeze. It was Tori, sitting on what appeared to be a hotel room bed, her hands bound behind her back and tape over her mouth. Her eyes were wide with fear, and there was a fresh bruise on her left cheek. Your sister is safe for now, Elena said conversationally, as if she were discussing the weather. But her continued well-being depends on your cooperation. I stared at the photo, fighting the urge to lunge across the table and grab Elena by the throat. You're insane if you think I'll sign anything while you're holding my sister hostage. I think you'll do exactly what I tell you to do, Elena replied calmly. Because the alternative is watching your sister suffer the consequences of your stubbornness. She swiped to another photo, this one showing a man's hands holding what appeared to be a knife near Tori's face. The threat was unmistakable. Sign the contract, Cassandra. Transfer your business assets to my management, and your sister goes home unharmed. And if I refuse? Elena's smile was cold and predatory. Then tomorrow morning the police will find her body in the Columbia River, and you'll spend the rest of your life knowing that your selfishness killed the only family you had left. The casual way she described murdering my sister made me feel physically sick, but it also crystallized my resolve. Elena Vasquez was a monster who viewed other people as disposable obstacles to her financial goals. She'd already destroyed other families, stolen other businesses, and hurt other innocent people. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated how far I was willing to go to protect the people I loved. You're right, I said quietly, reaching for the pen Elena offered. I don't really have a choice. Elena's triumphant smile told me she believed she'd won. She had no idea that every word of our conversation had been recorded, that Jimmy Sullivan was somewhere in the building gathering evidence, and that her threats had just provided the proof we needed to send her to prison for the rest of her life. As I positioned the pen over the signature line, I thought about my parents and the business they'd built through honest work and ethical practices. I thought about Tori, probably terrified and wondering if anyone was coming to save her. And I thought about all the other victims Elena had destroyed with her greed and callousness. "Just to be clear," I said, looking directly into Elena's eyes, "you're threatening to murder my sister if I don't sign over my business to you." "I'm offering you a choice," Elena corrected. "Your sister's life or your company's assets. Choose wisely." I signed my name on the contract, then set down the pen and met Elena's gaze. "There. It's done." Elena picked up the signed document and slipped it into her briefcase, her expression radiating satisfaction. "Pleasure doing business with you, Cassandra. Your sister will be released within the hour." "She'd better be," I said, standing from the table, "because if anything happens to her, I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you pay for it." Elena laughed as if I'd told an amusing joke. "Empty threats don't suit you, my dear. You're much too nice for that kind of behavior." As I walked away from the table, I touched the recording device hidden in my blazer button, knowing that Elena's confession was now preserved as evidence. She thought she'd won, but she'd actually just sealed her own fate. The elevator ride to the lobby felt like the longest minute of my life. Jimmy was waiting near the front entrance, and when our eyes met, he gave me a subtle nod that told me he'd located Tori. "Room 1247, he whispered as I walked past him toward the exit. "2 guards. Police are en route." I continued walking until I reached the parking garage, then collapsed against my car as the adrenaline finally hit me. In less than an hour, my sister would be free, Elena would be in custody, and the nightmare that had started 3 days ago would finally be over. But as I sat in my car waiting for Jimmy's signal, I realized that the hardest part was still ahead of me. Because when this was over, I'd have to face the reality that the man I'd married, the person I trusted with my heart and my future, had been willing to destroy my family for money. And I'd have to decide whether forgiveness was possible, or if some betrayals were simply too deep to heal. The keycard slid into the lock with a soft whisper, and the light blinked green. My hands were steady now, all the trembling replaced by cold determination. Jimmy had obtained the master keycard from Mrs. Caldwell, the hotel manager, after explaining the situation and showing her the evidence we'd gathered. She'd gone pale when she realized her hotel was being used to hold someone captive, immediately offering whatever assistance we needed. "Police are positioning themselves on the stairwells," Jimmy whispered through my earpiece. "Remember, your job is just to get visual confirmation that your sister is alive and unharmed. Don't engage with the guards. We'll handle the takedown." I pushed open the door to room 1247, and my heart nearly stopped. Tori was sitting on the edge of the bed, her ankles zip-tied together and her hands bound behind her back. Tape covered her mouth, but her eyes were alert and fierce. When she saw me, they widened with a mixture of relief and fear. 2 men were in the room with her. One was sitting in an armchair by the window, scrolling through his phone with the casual indifference of someone bored by routine work. The other was standing near the bathroom door, arms crossed, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Neither of them had noticed me yet. They were too comfortable, too confident, that their operation was proceeding smoothly. "Tori," I said quietly, and both men's heads snapped toward the door. The man by the window was on his feet instantly, his hand moving toward what was clearly a weapon concealed under his jacket. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm her sister," I said, stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind me. "And I'm here to take her home." The second man laughed, a harsh sound that made my skin crawl. "Lady, you must be out of your mind walking in here like this. Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you just bought yourself?" "Actually, I do," I replied, keeping my voice steady. Quote, "The question is whether you understand what kind of trouble you're already in." The man by the window had his weapon partially drawn now, but he hesitated when he saw that I wasn't showing any fear. "Back away from the door and put your hands where I can see them." Instead of complying, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone, holding it where both men could see the screen. On it was a live stream of police officers surrounding the hotel and taking positions in the hallway outside. "My name is Cassandra Donovan," I said calmly. 3 days ago, you kidnapped my sister on the orders of Elena Vasquez. Tonight, Elena tried to extort me into signing over my business by threatening to murder Tori. What you probably don't know is that everything Elena said was recorded, and copies of that recording are already in the hands of the FBI. The man near the bathroom had gone very pale. You're bluffing. Am I? I touched the screen of my phone and audio from my conversation with Elena began playing from the device's speaker. Elena's voice filled the room. Then tomorrow morning, the police will find her body in the Columbia River, and you'll spend the rest of your life knowing that your selfishness killed the only family you had left. Both men exchanged glances, and I could see uncertainty creeping into their expressions. They'd been hired for what they probably thought was a simple intimidation job, not a federal kidnapping case with murder threats. Here's what's going to happen, I continued, moving slowly toward Tori while keeping the phone visible. In about 30 seconds, federal agents are going to come through that door. You can surrender peacefully and cooperate with their investigation, or you can resist and face additional charges for assaulting federal officers. The man with the weapon looked toward the window as if considering an escape route, but we were 12 floors up with no fire escape access. His partner was staring at the door, probably calculating whether they could fight their way past however many agents were waiting outside. 20 seconds, I said, kneeling beside Tori and beginning to work at the tape covering her mouth. I should mention that Mrs. Caldwell, the hotel manager, has provided security footage showing exactly when you brought my sister to this room. The FBI also has records of the credit card used to book this room, which traces back to one of Elena's shell companies. The tape came free from Tori's mouth, and she gasped, "Cass, there are more of them. Marcus is here somewhere, and Derek too. They were talking about moving me tonight after Elena finished meeting with you." I felt my blood turn to ice. If Marcus was in the building, it meant he was directly supervising Tori's captivity, rather than maintaining plausible deniability. The level of his involvement was even worse than I'd imagined. 10 seconds, I said, working at the zip ties around Tori's ankles. The plastic was thick and tight, cutting into her skin where she'd struggled against them. The man with the weapon made his decision. He holstered his gun and raised his hands. "We surrender. But lady, you have no idea what you're messing with. Elena Vasquez doesn't forget people who cross her." "Neither do I replied as the door burst open and tactical officers flooded into the room. The next few minutes were a blur of shouted commands, handcuffs, and Miranda rights. The 2 guards were taken into custody without resistance, though I noticed the one who'd threatened me kept glaring in my direction as if memorizing my face for future reference. A paramedic checked Tori over while crime scene technicians photographed the room and collected evidence. She was dehydrated and exhausted, with bruises on her wrists from the restraints but otherwise unharmed. "They kept asking me questions about what I'd overheard," Tori said as the paramedic cleaned the cuts on her wrists. "Elena wanted to know if I'd told anyone else about the conversation I witnessed, if I'd recorded anything, if I'd written anything down. When I told them I'd only talked to you, they seemed relieved." "What about Marcus?" I asked. "How involved was he in keeping you here?" Tori's expression darkened. "He was here yesterday morning when they brought me food. He acted like this was all necessary for business reasons, and kept saying it would be over soon. Cass, he talked about you like you were some kind of obstacle he had to manage rather than his wife. The casual cruelty of it was almost harder to process than the criminal aspects. Marcus hadn't just betrayed our marriage for money. He'd psychologically dehumanized me to justify his actions. In his mind, I'd become nothing more than a target to be manipulated and robbed." Agent Sarah Chen, the FBI supervisor coordinating the operation, approached us as the paramedic finished examining Tori. She was a compact woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and the kind of calm authority that suggested extensive experience with complex cases. "Mrs. Donovan, we're going to need detailed statements from both you and your sister," Agent Chen said. "But first, I wanted to let you know that we've arrested Elena Vasquez in the hotel restaurant. The recording you obtained provided sufficient evidence for federal kidnapping and extortion charges." "What about Marcus?" I asked. "My sister says he was directly involved in holding her here." Agent Chen consulted her notepad. "We're currently searching the building for Marcus Donovan and Derek Yamamoto. Hotel security footage shows them entering the building earlier this evening, but they haven't been located yet." As if summoned by her words, Agent Chen's radio crackled to life. "We've got movement on the 14th floor. 2 male subjects attempting to access the service elevator." "That's them," Agent Chen said into her radio. "Apprehend for questioning." She turned back to me. Mrs. Donovan, I need to ask you about the financial crimes your husband and his associates have committed. We'll need access to your business records to document the full extent of the theft. I nodded, though part of me was still processing the surreal reality that my husband was being hunted by federal agents in a hotel where he'd helped imprison my sister. 3 days ago, he'd been kissing me goodbye in our kitchen and promising to pick up groceries on his way home from work. There's something else you should know, I said. I signed a document tonight giving Elena's company control of my business. She forced me to sign it by threatening to kill Tori. Agent Chen made a note. That contract will be void due to coercion and duress. We'll make sure it has no legal standing. However, we'll need the original document as evidence. Elena has it in her briefcase, I said. She seemed very pleased with herself when I signed it. We'll recover it during the search of her belongings, Agent Chen assured me. In the meantime, I'd recommend having your attorney review all your business accounts and financial records. If your husband had access to your banking information, there might be additional unauthorized transactions we haven't discovered yet. The elevator dinged, and 2 agents emerged escorting Marcus and Derek in handcuffs. Marcus's usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his tie askew, and his shirt wrinkled. When he saw me sitting with Tori, his expression went through a rapid series of changes. Surprise, fear, anger, and finally a kind of desperate calculation. Cass, he called out as the agents walked him past us. This isn't what it looks like. I can explain everything. I stood up slowly, meeting his eyes for what I knew would be the last time as his wife. Can you explain why my sister has rope burns on her wrists? Can you explain why you lied to me for 3 days while she was being held prisoner? Can you explain why you were willing to let Elena threaten to murder her? Marcus's mouth opened and closed without sound, like a fish pulled from water. Finally, he said, "It was never supposed to go this far. Elena promised no one would get hurt." "But you were willing to take that risk," I replied. Quote, "You were willing to gamble with Tori's life for money." "It wasn't about the money," Marcus said desperately as the agents continued walking him toward the elevator. "It was about building something bigger, about having real influence in this city. You never understood my vision." "No," I said quietly. "I never understood your willingness to destroy people to achieve it." The elevator doors closed on Marcus's pleading expression, and I felt something inside me finally break free. Not my heart, exactly, but the last remnants of the illusion that our marriage had been based on love rather than opportunity. Agent Chen returned to where Tori and I were sitting. "We're going to need you both to come to the federal building tomorrow to give formal statements. Tonight, I'd recommend going somewhere safe where you can rest and process what's happened." "Can we go home?" Tori asked. "I just want to sleep in my own bed." "Actually," Agent Chen said carefully, "I'd suggest staying somewhere else tonight. We don't know if Elena's organization has other associates who might try to retaliate. Is there a hotel or a friend's house where you could stay?" The thought that we might still be in danger hadn't occurred to me. I'd been so focused on rescuing Tori that I hadn't considered whether Elena might have backup plans or vengeful colleagues. "My mentor, Dr. Negan, has a guest room," I said. "She'd be happy to let us stay there." "Good," Agent Chen said. "We'll have agents check on you periodically until we're confident the threat has been neutralized." An hour later, Tori and I were sitting in Patricia Nuchen's cozy living room, wrapped in blankets and drinking the chamomile tea she'd insisted on making. Patricia had taken the news of our ordeal with the calm professionalism of someone who'd spent decades helping people process trauma, but I could see the anger burning behind her composed exterior. "What Elena did to you both is unconscionable," Patricia said as she settled into her armchair with her own cup of tea. "Using family bonds as leverage for financial crimes represents a particularly cruel form of psychological manipulation." "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed," I said. "How long was Marcus planning this? How many of our conversations were him gathering information rather than sharing his life with me?" "Those are natural questions," Patricia replied, "but try not to torture yourself with them. Sophisticated manipulators are skilled at maintaining false personas for extended periods. The fact that you trusted your husband doesn't reflect poorly on your judgment. It reflects poorly on his character. Tori curled up on the couch next to me, still processing her own trauma. I was so scared, she said quietly. Not just that they might hurt me, but that you might not figure out where I was in time. I put my arm around her shoulders, feeling the weight of responsibility I'd carried since our parents died. I would have torn this city apart looking for you. There was never any doubt about that. I know, Tori said. That's probably why they targeted me, instead of going after you directly. They knew you'd do anything to protect me. The casual, strategic thinking behind the kidnapping was chilling. Elena and her associates had studied our family dynamics carefully enough to identify exactly which pressure points would be most effective. Cass, Tori continued, what are you going to do about the business? Even with Elena arrested, she might have already done damage to your client relationships or financial standing. It was a practical concern I hadn't had time to fully consider. I'll need to contact every client and vendor to explain what happened and reassure them about the company's stability. I'll also need to review every financial transaction from the past 6 months to identify any unauthorized activities. Patricia leaned forward in her chair. You should also consider changing all your passwords, closing any accounts Marcus had access to, and possibly implementing new security measures for your business operations. The scope of the cleanup required was overwhelming. Marcus had been involved in every aspect of my personal and professional life for 2 years. Untangling his influence and potential sabotage would take months. My phone buzzed with a text from Jimmy Sullivan. All subjects in custody. Elena singing like a canary about other victims and ongoing schemes. You did good tonight, kid. I showed the message to Tori and Patricia. At least it's over, I said. The immediate danger is over, Patricia corrected gently. But recovery from this kind of betrayal is a process, not an event. You'll both need time to rebuild your sense of trust and security. We talked until nearly 3 a.m, processing the events of the past few days and beginning to plan for the challenges ahead. Eventually, exhaustion overcame adrenaline, and we settled into Patricia's guest bedroom, Tori falling asleep almost immediately while I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I thought about Marcus sitting in a federal holding cell, probably calculating his legal options and wondering how much Elena would reveal about their partnership. I thought about Elena herself, a woman whose childhood poverty had twisted into adult cruelty, destroying other families to build her own financial empire. But mostly I thought about my parents and the business they'd built through honest work and ethical relationships. They'd created something valuable not by taking from others, but by providing genuine service to their clients and fair treatment to their employees. Marcus had seen that business as an opportunity to exploit. Elena had seen it as an asset to steal, but I was beginning to see it as something else entirely. A foundation for rebuilding not just my financial security, but my faith in the possibility of conducting business with integrity and honor. The next morning brought a cascade of practical concerns. Agent Chen called at 8 to schedule our formal interviews. My attorney called at 9 to discuss the legal implications of the signed contract and the financial irregularities Marcus had created. Mrs. Caldwell from the Sterling Grand called at 10 to apologize profusely for her hotel being used in the kidnapping and to offer whatever assistance she could provide. But the call that surprised me came at 11 from Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a family law attorney Patricia had recommended. Mrs. Donovan, he said in a voice that managed to be both professional and compassionate. Dr. Nguyen asked me to contact you about divorce proceedings. Given the criminal charges against your husband, we'll need to move quickly to protect your personal and business assets. The word divorce hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd known it was inevitable. How quickly? I asked. Ideally, we'd file the initial paperwork today, Dr. Rodriguez replied. With your husband facing federal charges, there's a risk that prosecutors might attempt to freeze marital assets as part of their investigation. We need to establish clear separation of your business holdings before that happens. I agreed to meet with him that afternoon, then spent the rest of the morning at the FBI field office giving my formal statement. The process was exhausting but cathartic, allowing me to tell the complete story of Marcus's deception and Elena's crimes in a setting where I knew justice would be pursued. Agent Chen walked me through the evidence they'd collected. Financial records showing the systematic theft from my business accounts. Hotel security footage documenting Tori's captivity. The recorded confession Elena had made in the restaurant. And text messages recovered from Marcus's phone, detailing the conspiracy. Your husband is cooperating with our investigation, Agent Chen told me. He's provided information about other businesses Elena has targeted, and other individuals who've been victimized by similar schemes. Is he hoping for leniency? I asked. Probably, Agent Chen replied honestly, but given the severity of the charges and the evidence we have, cooperation will only go so far in reducing his sentence. That afternoon, I met with Dr. Rodriguez in his downtown office. He was a thoughtful man in his 50s who explained legal concepts in clear terms without talking down to me. We spent 2 hours reviewing my financial situation and planning the divorce strategy. The good news is that Oregon law should protect your business since it was inherited property acquired before the marriage, Dr. Rodriguez explained. The challenging part will be documenting exactly what Marcus took and ensuring full restitution. What about the house we bought together? I asked. That will likely need to be sold, with proceeds divided according to each party's contribution to the purchase price. Since your business provided the down payment, you should receive the majority of any equity. I signed the divorce papers with the same steady hand that had signed Elena's fraudulent contract the night before. But this time the signature represented freedom rather than coercion. By evening, I was emotionally and physically drained. Tori and I returned to Patricia's house, where she'd prepared a simple dinner and created a calm environment for us to continue processing the dramatic changes in our lives. I keep thinking about what Marcus said about building something bigger. I told him over dinner. The scary thing is that I understand the ambition. I want to grow the business too, to honor what our parents built by expanding their vision. The difference, Patricia said, is that you want to build something through ethical means. Marcus was willing to build on a foundation of theft and deception. But how do I know I won't make similar mistakes? I asked. How do I know I can trust my judgment about people after being so wrong about someone I lived with for 2 years? Tori reached across the table to squeeze my hand. Because you spent 3 days fighting to save me, when you could have just signed those papers and protected yourself. Because you recorded Elena's confession, knowing it might put you in danger. Because you've always put family and integrity above money and convenience. Her words hit me harder than any comfort Patricia could have offered as a professional. Tori had seen me at my most desperate and frightened, and she'd also seen me at my most determined and courageous. Her perspective on my character carried weight that no amount of self-reflection could provide. You know what I realized tonight? I said. Marcus thought he was so clever, manipulating me and stealing from the business while maintaining his cover as a loving husband. But he made one crucial error in his planning. What's that? Patricia asked. He underestimated how far I'd go to protect the people I love. He thought I'd be paralyzed by fear or loyalty, that I'd choose him over Tori if forced to make that choice. But family bonds aren't just vulnerabilities to be exploited. They're also sources of strength and motivation. I looked at Tori, remembering the terror I'd felt when I realized she was in danger, and the cold determination that had replaced that terror once I understood what needed to be done. Elena was right about one thing, I continued. Sometimes you do have to be willing to take what you deserve. The difference is in how you define deserving. She thought she deserved whatever she could steal. I think we deserve safety, honesty, and the chance to build something good without having it destroyed by other people's greed. Later that night, as I finally drifted off to sleep in Patricia's guest room, I thought about the weeks and months ahead. There would be legal proceedings, financial recovery efforts, and the long process of rebuilding trust in my personal relationships. The business would need attention and possibly restructuring. Tori would need support as she processed her own trauma from the kidnapping. But for the first time in 3 days, I felt hopeful rather than afraid. Marcus and Elena had tried to break down everything my family had built, but they'd actually revealed how strong those foundations really were. The business had survived their theft attempts. Tori and I had survived their manipulation and violence. And I'd discovered reservoirs of courage and determination I hadn't known I possessed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight I was safe. My sister was safe. And the people who'd tried to destroy us were in custody. After everything we'd been through, that felt like a victory worth celebrating. In the darkness of the guest room, I could hear Tori's steady breathing beside me, finally peaceful after 3 days of terror. Outside, Portland slept under a sky that was slowly clearing after days of rain, promising sunshine in the morning. For the first time since this nightmare began, I believed that sunshine was actually coming. 6 weeks later, I stood in the marble lobby of the federal courthouse, watching Marcus walk through the security checkpoint in an orange jumpsuit and shackles. He'd lost weight during his time in custody, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and mounting anxiety. When he glanced in my direction, I saw a flicker of the charm that had once drawn me to him, but it was overshadowed by something desperate and calculating. Mrs. Donovan, his defense attorney, approached me with the kind of professional smile that never reached the eyes. I wonder if we might have a word about the victim impact statement you're planning to deliver today. I adjusted the folder in my hands, feeling the weight of the documents inside. 6 weeks of investigation had revealed the full scope of Marcus's betrayal, and today the court would hear exactly how deep the deception had run. What about it, Mr. Patterson? My client is prepared to offer full restitution for any financial losses, plus additional compensation for the emotional distress caused to you and your sister. In exchange, we're hoping you might consider a statement that emphasizes his cooperation with federal investigators. The audacity was breathtaking. Marcus had stolen nearly $400,000 from my business, orchestrated my sister's kidnapping, and threatened to destroy everything my parents had built, and now he wanted me to help minimize his consequences. Mr. Patterson, I said calmly, your client spent 2 years lying to me about his most basic motivations and values. He participated in holding my sister prisoner and threatening her life. Do you really think I'm interested in helping him avoid accountability? Patterson's smile faltered. Mrs. Donovan, I understand you're angry, but consider that harsh sentencing won't undo what's been done. Marcus has valuable information about Elena Vasquez's other criminal enterprises. His cooperation could help other victims recover their losses. Then he should cooperate because it's the right thing to do, not because he expects leniency in return. I replied. And Mr. Patterson? I'm not angry. Anger implies I still care about your client's well-being. What I am is committed to making sure he faces the full consequences of his choices. As Patterson walked away, I felt Tori's hand squeeze my shoulder. She'd insisted on coming to the sentencing hearing despite her therapist's suggestion that it might be re-traumatizing. I need to see this through, she'd said. I need to watch justice actually happen. Agent Chen approached us with the prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Maria Santos, who'd been building the federal case against Elena's organization for the past month and a half. The investigation had uncovered a network of financial crimes spanning 5 states, with at least 12 other families victimized by similar schemes. Are you ready for this? Agent Santos asked. The judge has reviewed all the evidence, but your victim impact statement will help her understand the personal cost of these crimes. I nodded, though my stomach was churning with nervous energy. Public speaking had never been my forte, but this wasn't about performance or persuasion. This was about truth, and truth had become something I valued more than comfort or convenience. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with dark wood paneling and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in harsh relief. Marcus sat at the defendant's table between his attorneys, occasionally whispering urgent questions that they answered with subtle headshakes. Elena wasn't present. Her case was being tried separately due to the complexity of the charges and the number of victims involved. Judge Catherine Morrison called the court to order with a brisk efficiency that suggested she'd presided over countless similar hearings. She was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see through pretense and misdirection. We're here today for the sentencing of Marcus James Donovan, who has pleaded guilty to charges of conspiracy, wire fraud, money laundering, and accessory to kidnapping, Judge Morrison announced. Before I impose sentence, I'll hear from the victims in this case. Tori went first, her voice steady but quiet as she described the 3 days of captivity and the lasting impact on her sense of security. I used to walk through the city feeling safe and confident, she said. Now I constantly look over my shoulder, wondering if someone is watching me or planning to use me as leverage against my sister. The defendant and his associates didn't just steal money. They stole my peace of mind. When my turn came, I walked to the podium feeling strangely calm. Marcus was watching me intently, and I could see him trying to read my expression, probably hoping for some sign of lingering affection or sympathy. He was going to be disappointed. Quote, "Your Honor," I began. "6 weeks ago, I thought I was married to a man who loved me and supported my goals. I thought I was building a life with someone who shared my values and respected my family. Today I understand that I was actually living with a stranger who had spent 2 years systematically deceiving me about his most fundamental characteristics." I opened my folder and pulled out the financial documents Agent Chen had helped me compile. The defendant stole $387,000 from my business over the course of 18 months. He established fake consulting agreements, diverted client payments, and set up unauthorized transfers that nearly bankrupted the company my parents spent their lives building. Marcus shifted in his seat, his attorneys placing restraining hands on his arms as if anticipating an outburst. But the financial theft, while devastating, wasn't the worst of his crimes. I continued. The defendant participated in kidnapping my sister and holding her prisoner for 3 days. He watched me suffer through her disappearance, comforting me and helping me search for her, all while knowing exactly where she was being held and why. My voice remained steady, but I could feel the emotional weight of the words. He was willing to let me believe my sister might be dead, rather than compromise his criminal enterprise. He was willing to risk her life, my life, and the lives of everyone Elena Vasquez had targeted, all for money that didn't belong to him. I looked directly at Marcus, who was staring at his hands rather than meeting my eyes. "Your Honor, the defendant's attorneys have suggested that he deserves leniency because he's provided information about other crimes. But cooperation isn't redemption. Helping to catch other criminals doesn't undo the harm he caused to my family." Judge Morrison was taking notes, occasionally glancing up to study my expression. "Is there anything else you'd like the court to know, Mrs. Donovan?" "Just this," I said. The defendant didn't just commit crimes against individuals. He committed crimes against the idea that marriage should be based on honesty and trust, that family relationships should be sources of support rather than vulnerability, and that business should be conducted with integrity rather than deception. When we allow those violations to go unpunished or underpunished, we're telling other would-be criminals that these fundamental social bonds are acceptable targets for exploitation. I returned to my seat, feeling emotionally drained but satisfied that I'd said what needed to be said. Marcus was looking at me now with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between regret and resentment. The prosecutor presented additional evidence of Marcus's crimes, including financial records showing the systematic nature of the theft and recorded conversations revealing his knowledge of the kidnapping plot. She recommended a sentence of 8 to 10 years in federal prison, emphasizing the sophistication of the scheme and the psychological trauma inflicted on the victims. Marcus's defense team made their case for leniency, arguing that he'd been manipulated by Elena Vasquez, and that his cooperation with investigators demonstrated genuine remorse. They requested a sentence of 3 to 5 years, with credit for time served and early release for good behavior. When given the opportunity to make a statement on his own behalf, Marcus stood slowly and faced the judge. He looked older than his 32 years, worn down by weeks of incarceration and the weight of his choices. "Your Honor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know that nothing I say can undo the harm I've caused. I know that I've destroyed my marriage, traumatized my sister-in-law, and violated the trust of everyone who believed in me." He glanced in my direction, but I kept my expression neutral, refusing to give him the emotional reaction he seemed to be seeking. "I want the court to know that I never intended for anyone to be physically harmed," Marcus continued. "When Elena suggested using Tori as leverage, I thought it would just be a brief intimidation tactic. I didn't realize she was planning to hold her for days or threaten her life." Quote, "The statement revealed exactly why Marcus deserved no sympathy. Even in his supposed moment of contrition, he was minimizing his role and shifting blame to Elena. He still didn't understand that participating in any level of kidnapping made him fully responsible for whatever escalation occurred. Judge Morrison listened impassively, making occasional notes but revealing nothing about her thoughts on the testimony. When Marcus finished speaking, she reviewed her files for several long minutes while the courtroom waited in tense silence. "Mr. Donovan," she finally said, "this court has reviewed extensive evidence of your criminal conduct, including financial records, recorded conversations, and testimony from multiple witnesses. The evidence shows a pattern of calculated deception spanning more than 2 years, culminating in your participation in a kidnapping plot that placed an innocent young woman in mortal danger." Marcus straightened in his chair, probably hoping for signs that his expression of remorse had been persuasive. "While the court acknowledges your cooperation with federal investigators," Judge Morrison continued, "cooperation is expected, not exceptional. You provided information about other crimes only after being caught, and only as part of a plea agreement designed to minimize your own sentence." She opened a thick folder and consulted what appeared to be sentencing guidelines. The court must balance several factors in determining an appropriate sentence: the severity of the crimes, the impact on the victims, the defendant's criminal history, and the likelihood of rehabilitation versus recidivism. The silence stretched on as Judge Morrison reviewed additional documents. I could hear Marcus breathing heavily at the defendant's table, and his attorneys were exchanging worried glances. "The financial crimes alone would warrant significant prison time," Judge Morrison said. "The defendant systematically stole nearly $400,000 from a small business, using his position as the victim's husband to gain access to confidential financial information. This represents a profound violation of both legal and ethical boundaries." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the courtroom. However, the kidnapping charges represent an even more serious offense. The defendant participated in a conspiracy to deprive Ms. Victoria Hartwell of her liberty, for the purpose of coercing her sister into surrendering valuable assets. The victim was held against her will for 3 days, during which time her life was threatened, and her physical safety was at risk. Marcus was visibly trembling now, and one of his attorneys placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "The court finds that the defendant's actions were not impulsive or the result of poor judgment under pressure." Judge Morrison continued, "These were calculated crimes planned and executed over an extended period. The defendant had multiple opportunities to withdraw from the conspiracy or to warn the victims, and he chose not to take any of those opportunities." I felt Tori's hand slip into mine, both of us holding our breath as the judge prepared to announce the sentence. Furthermore, Judge Morrison said, "The court is troubled by the defendant's apparent lack of genuine remorse. Even today, in his statement to this court, the defendant attempted to minimize his role and shift responsibility to his co-conspirators. This suggests a fundamental failure to accept accountability for his choices." Judge Morrison closed the folder and looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Donovan, please stand for sentencing." Marcus rose unsteadily, his attorneys flanking him for support. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system humming overhead. "On the charges of conspiracy and wire fraud, I sentence you to 6 years in federal prison. On the charges of money laundering, I sentence you to 4 years in federal prison, to run concurrently with the first sentence. On the charge of accessory to kidnapping, I sentence you to 8 years in federal prison, to run consecutively with the previous sentences." I did the math quickly in my head. 14 years total. Marcus would be 46 years old when he was released, assuming he served the full sentence. Additionally, Judge Morrison continued, "You are ordered to pay full restitution to the victims in the amount of $387,000, plus interest and penalties. You will serve 3 years of supervised probation following your release from prison, during which time you will be prohibited from engaging in any financial services or business management activities." Marcus swayed slightly, and his attorneys moved closer to support him. The sentence was harsher than even the prosecution had recommended, reflecting Judge Morrison's assessment of the crimes, severity, and Marcus's failure to demonstrate genuine remorse. "The court hopes," Judge Morrison concluded, "that this sentence will serve both as punishment for the defendant's crimes and as a deterrent to others who might consider exploiting personal relationships for criminal gain." As the bailiff approached to escort Marcus back to custody, he turned toward me one final time. His expression was a mixture of disbelief, anger, and something that might have been regret. For a moment, I saw a flash of the man I'd thought I'd married, but it was quickly replaced by the calculating look of someone already planning his next move. "Cass," he called out as the bailiff reached for his arm. "I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry for everything." I looked at him for a long moment, considering whether there was anything left to say. Finally, I replied, "I'm sorry too, Marcus. I'm sorry you chose money over love. I'm sorry you chose deception over honesty. And I'm sorry you'll spend the next 14 years learning why those were the wrong choices." The bailiff led him away, and I watched the man I'd once promised to love and honor disappear through a door that would keep him locked away until I was 42 years old. I felt relief, sadness, and a strange sense of closure all at once. Outside the courthouse, Agent Chen and Prosecutor Santos briefed us on the status of Elena's case. She was facing even more serious charges, including racketeering and multiple counts of kidnapping, fraud, and extortion related to her other victims. Her trial was scheduled for the following month, and they expected a conviction that would result in a life sentence. "Your testimony and the evidence you helped gather were crucial to building the case against the entire organization," Agent Chen told us. "We've identified 14 other victims across 5 states, and several of them are going to recover assets they thought were lost forever." "What about Derek Yamamoto?" Tori asked. "He's cooperating fully with our investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence," Prosecutor Santos replied. "He'll probably serve 2 to 3 years, but his information has been invaluable in understanding how Elena recruited accomplices and identified targets." As we walked toward the parking garage, I reflected on how much had changed in the 6 weeks since Tori's rescue. The business was not only surviving but actually growing, as several clients had increased their contracts after learning about the crisis we'd weathered. Tori was back in school and seeing a therapist to process her trauma, but she was resilient and determined not to let the experience define her future. I'd moved out of the house Marcus and I had shared, selling it and using the proceeds to pay down business debt and establish a stronger financial foundation. Tori and I had found a small apartment in the Alberta Arts District, close enough to downtown for my work but far enough from our old neighborhood to feel like a fresh start. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Tori said as we drove through the city. "How different things might have been if I hadn't overheard that conversation between Marcus and Elena. What if I'd just walked past without stopping to listen? Then they would have succeeded in stealing everything," I replied. "But you did stop, and you did listen, and you had the courage to tell me what you'd heard, even though you knew it would hurt me." "I was so scared you wouldn't believe me," Tori admitted. "Marcus could be very convincing when he wanted to be." "He was convincing," I agreed. "But you were more convincing because you were telling the truth. That's something I'm going to remember the next time someone tries to manipulate me with charm and false urgency." We drove in comfortable silence for a while, both of us processing the finality of Marcus's sentencing. The legal proceedings weren't completely over, but today had marked the end of our direct involvement in seeking justice for his crimes. "Cass," Tori said as we pulled into our apartment complex, "what Elena said about taking what you deserve, that stuck with me. Do you think she was right about that, even if she applied it in a terrible way?" I considered the question as we climbed the stairs to our second-floor apartment. "I think she was right that passive people often get taken advantage of," I said finally. "But I think she was wrong about what we deserve. She thought she deserved whatever she could take from other people. I think we deserve honesty, safety, and the chance to build something good, without having it destroyed by other people's greed." Inside our apartment, I made tea while Tori sorted through the mail that had accumulated while we were at court. Most of it was routine bills and business correspondence, but there was one envelope that made me smile. "What's that?" Tori asked, noticing my expression. "A thank you card from one of Elena's other victims," I said, opening the envelope. "She's a woman in Seattle whose ex-husband tried to steal her catering business using Elena's playbook. Apparently our case helped the FBI identify the pattern and prevent her from losing everything." The card was handwritten and heartfelt, expressing gratitude for our courage in pursuing justice even when it meant risking our own safety. It was signed by the woman and her 3 teenage children, all of whom had been threatened during Elena's attempted theft of their family business. That makes it all worth it, Tori said, reading over my shoulder. Knowing that our nightmare helped protect other families. As evening fell over Portland, I stood at our apartment window looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Elena Vasquez was in federal custody, preparing for a trial that would likely result in her spending the rest of her life in prison. Marcus was beginning what would be 14 years of incarceration, finally facing consequences for his choices. And Derek Yamamoto was probably in a witness protection program, trading information about financial crimes for reduced charges. But here, in our small apartment with its mismatched furniture and amateur artwork, Tori and I were building something new. Not just a home or a business, but a way of living that prioritized honesty over convenience, family over profit, and integrity over expedience. My phone buzzed with a text from Jimmy Sullivan. Saw the news about the sentencing. 14 years sounds about right. How are you holding up? I typed back. Better than I expected. Ready to move forward. Good, came his immediate reply. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about making sure good people feel safe to keep being good. I showed the message to Tori, who smiled and nodded. Jimmy's right, she said. That's exactly what this feels like. Like we can trust our instincts again. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about the woman I'd been 6 weeks ago. The one who'd believed her husband when he said he was working late and trusted his explanations for unusual financial transactions. That woman had been naive but not foolish, trusting but not gullible. She'd simply never imagined that someone could lie so thoroughly about their fundamental character. The woman I was now had been educated by betrayal and strengthened by adversity. She was more cautious but not cynical, more observant but not paranoid. She understood that trust must be earned gradually and proven consistently, that love without honesty is just manipulation, and that family bonds are worth fighting to protect. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. There were business decisions to make, client relationships to nurture, and the ongoing process of rebuilding financial security. Tori would continue her education and therapy, gradually reclaiming the sense of safety that Marcus and Elena had stolen from her. But tonight, for the first time in months, I fell asleep feeling genuinely optimistic about the future. Justice had been served, truth had prevailed, and the people who'd tried to destroy us were facing the consequences of their choices. The nightmare was finally over, and our real lives could begin again. 1 year later, I stood in the conference room of my newly expanded office space, watching Tori present a marketing campaign to a room full of hotel executives. She'd graduated with honors and joined the company as our youngest account manager, bringing fresh perspectives and an intuitive understanding of digital marketing that complemented my traditional approach. The luxury travel market is shifting toward experiential authenticity, Tori explained, clicking through slides that showcased her innovative campaign concepts. Millennials and Gen Z travelers aren't just buying hotel rooms. They're investing in stories they can share and memories they can treasure. Mrs. Caldwell from the Sterling Grand was among the executives in the room, and she nodded approvingly as Tori outlined strategies for transforming routine business travel into memorable experiences. The irony wasn't lost on me that the hotel where my sister had been held captive was now one of our most valued clients, their partnership born from Mrs. Caldwell's determination to make amends for her property being used in criminal activities. After the presentation ended and our clients filed out, expressing enthusiasm for Tori's proposals, I found myself alone with my sister in the conference room, where we'd just secured our largest contract to date. "Dad would be proud," I said, straightening the papers scattered across the mahogany table. "You've got his gift for understanding what people really want, not just what they say they want." Tori smiled, but I could see the thoughtful expression that had become more common since her ordeal. She'd emerged from therapy stronger and more focused, but also more aware of the complexities and potential dangers in human relationships. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never overheard Marcus and Elena that day," she said, sinking into one of the leather chairs. "Would they have succeeded in taking everything? Would we have figured it out eventually?" "We'll never know," I replied, settling across from her. "But I've stopped torturing myself with hypothetical scenarios. What matters is how we responded when we discovered the truth. The past year had been a journey of reconstruction and growth that neither of us could have imagined during those terrifying days in October. The business had not only recovered from Marcus's theft, but had expanded beyond anything our parents had envisioned. Word of our experience had spread through Portland's business community, creating unexpected opportunities as other entrepreneurs sought our counsel on protecting their assets and identifying trustworthy partners. Dr. Patricia Nguyen had suggested I consider sharing our story more broadly, perhaps through speaking engagements or writing, as a way to help other families recognize and respond to similar threats. The idea had seemed overwhelming at first, but as I'd connected with Elena's other victims and seen the patterns of manipulation they'd experienced, I'd begun to understand the value of education and awareness. "I got a call from Agent Chen this morning," I said, pulling out my phone to show Tori the message I'd received. "Elena's appeal was denied. Her life sentence is final." Tori read the text silently, her expression thoughtful rather than celebratory. "How do you feel about that?" "Relief, mostly," I admitted, knowing she can never hurt another family the way she hurt ours, but also sadness for the person she might have been if she'd chosen different paths. It was a complex emotion I'd been working through in my own therapy sessions. Elena's childhood poverty and immigrant experience weren't excuses for her crimes, but they provided context for understanding how someone could develop such a twisted relationship with money and power. Her brilliance and strategic thinking could have been used to build legitimate businesses and help other entrepreneurs succeed, but instead, she'd chosen to prey on the vulnerabilities of trusting people. Marcus's quarterly letters from federal prison had become less frequent as the months passed. His initial correspondence had been filled with apologies and expressions of regret, but also subtle attempts to maintain emotional connection and perhaps influence my feelings about his eventual release. I'd stopped responding after the third letter, when it became clear that he was still more interested in managing my perception of him than in genuinely accepting responsibility for his choices. "Have you thought about what you'll do when Marcus gets out?" Tori asked, as if reading my thoughts. "That's 13 years away," I said. "By then, I'll be a completely different person living a completely different life. He'll be a stranger whose path happened to cross mine briefly." It was true in ways that still surprised me. The woman who trusted Marcus completely seemed like someone I'd known long ago, naive and hopeful in ways that were both admirable and dangerous. The woman I'd become was more cautious but not cynical, more discerning but not judgmental, more protective but not paranoid. My phone buzzed with a text from Jimmy Sullivan. "Coffee tomorrow? Have a business proposition that might interest you." I showed the message to Tori, who grinned. "Jimmy's been dropping hints about some kind of consulting venture for weeks. I think he wants to partner with us on something." Jimmy had become a close friend over the past year, helping me navigate the practical challenges of rebuilding financial security while processing the emotional aftermath of such profound betrayal. His experience as a private investigator had given him unique insights into how criminals identified and exploited their targets. Knowledge that had proven valuable as I'd worked to strengthen our business's security measures. Speaking of partnerships, Tori said, "Dr. Rodriguez called while you were in your client meeting. The final divorce decree came through. You're officially free." The words should have carried more emotional weight, but the truth was that I'd felt free for months. The legal formalities were just paperwork catching up to psychological reality. Marcus had ceased to be my husband the moment I'd discovered his deception. Everything since then had been administrative cleanup. "How does it feel?" Tori asked. "Like closing a book I'd already finished reading," I said. The story was over long before the final page. That evening, I drove through the Alberta Arts District, where Tori and I had built our new life. Our apartment had been replaced 6 months ago by a small house with a garden where I'd started growing the vegetables and herbs our mother had loved. It wasn't the grand Victorian Marcus and I had shared, but it was entirely mine, purchased with money I'd earned honestly and decorated according to my own preferences, rather than someone else's vision of success. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a familiar car parked across the street. Derek Yamamoto climbed out as I approached my front door, looking nervous and significantly thinner than he'd been during his brief incarceration. "Cassandra, he called out, raising his hands to show he wasn't carrying anything threatening. I know you probably don't want to see me, but I was hoping we could talk for a few minutes. I studied his face, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the way his clothes hung loose on his frame. His cooperation with federal investigators had earned him a reduced sentence, but it was clear that the experience had taken a significant toll. What do you want, Derek? To apologize, he said simply, and to thank you for not pushing for a harsher sentence when you could have. I unlocked my front door but didn't invite him inside. I didn't advocate for leniency to help you. I did it because I believed your cooperation was genuinely helping other victims. I know, Derek said. But I wanted you to understand that what we did to you and Tori, it wasn't personal. Elena made it seem like a victimless crime. Like we were just moving money around on paper. There's no such thing as a victimless crime when real people's lives are involved, I replied. You knew Marcus was married to me. You knew he was stealing from a business that employed real people and served real clients. You chose not to think about the consequences because they were inconvenient to acknowledge. Derek nodded, looking genuinely ashamed. You're right. I convinced myself that rich people could afford to lose money, that successful businesses had insurance for theft, that no one would really be hurt by what we were doing. And now? Now I understand that financial security isn't just about money. It's about trust and stability and the ability to plan for the future. When we stole from you, we weren't just taking dollars. We were attacking your ability to feel safe in the world. It was the most insightful thing I'd heard Derek say during the entire legal process. His cooperation with investigators had been motivated by self-interest, but this conversation suggested he'd developed a genuine understanding of the harm he'd caused. I've started working with a nonprofit that helps small business owners protect themselves from financial fraud, Derek continued. It doesn't make up for what I did, but at least I'm using my experience to prevent other people from being victimized. That's good, I said, and meant it. Redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about choosing to do better in the future. After Derek left, I sat in my garden as darkness fell over Portland, thinking about the different paths people chose when confronted with moral choices. Elena had chosen to embrace cruelty and exploitation as tools for achieving her goals. Marcus had chosen to prioritize his ambitions over his relationships and ethical obligations. Derek had initially chosen to ignore the consequences of his actions, but eventually chose to face them and work toward making amends. I'd chosen to fight for my family and my values, even when it meant risking my safety and confronting painful truths about someone I'd loved. Tori had chosen to trust me with dangerous information and support our family's recovery, despite her own trauma. The next morning, I met Jimmy at our usual coffee shop in the Pearl District. He was waiting with 2 cups and a folder thick with documents, wearing the slightly mischievous expression that usually meant he was about to propose something ambitious. I've been thinking about your speaking engagements, he said without preamble. The response has been incredible. Business owners, law enforcement, victim advocacy groups, they all want to hear your story and learn from your experience. It's been rewarding, I agreed, but also exhausting. Reliving that time period over and over again takes an emotional toll. What if we could help people prevent these crimes instead of just responding to them after they happen? Jimmy opened his folder and pulled out what appeared to be a business plan. I'm proposing a consulting firm that specializes in helping small business owners identify vulnerabilities and implement protective measures. I scanned the first few pages, noting the comprehensive approach he'd outlined. Financial security assessments, background check services for key employees and partners, legal review of business agreements, and ongoing monitoring for signs of fraud or manipulation. You want to create a prevention-focused version of what we went through, I said. Exactly. Your story resonates with people because it could happen to anyone. Successful, intelligent business owners who thought they were being careful still fell victim to sophisticated manipulation. Imagine if we could help them recognize the warning signs before it was too late. The idea was compelling, but I could see potential challenges. This kind of consulting requires a high level of trust. Clients would need to share their most sensitive financial information and personal relationships with us. Which is why you'd be perfect for it, Jimmy said. You've experienced the worst-case scenario and emerged stronger. People will trust you because you understand what they're risking and what they stand to lose. I thought about the conversations I'd had with Elena's other victims, the common themes of manipulation and exploitation that had emerged. Most of them had recognized warning signs, but dismissed them as paranoia or overreaction. They'd wanted to trust the people close to them and had paid a devastating price for that trust. "What about Tori?" I asked. "She's just getting established in her career with our marketing firm." "This could be a family business," Jimmy suggested. "She's got natural instincts for reading people and situations, plus first-hand experience with how these schemes unfold. Her generation also understands digital security and social media vulnerabilities that older consultants might miss." By the time we finished our second cups of coffee, I found myself genuinely excited about the possibility. It would mean expanding beyond marketing into a completely different field. But it would also mean using our experience to protect other families from the devastation we'd endured. That afternoon, I presented the consulting idea to Tori, who listened with growing enthusiasm as I explained Jimmy's proposal and the potential impact we could have. "I love it," she said immediately. "We could prevent other sisters from being kidnapped, other wives from being betrayed, other families from losing everything they've worked to build. It would mean starting over in some ways," I cautioned. "Building new expertise, developing new relationships, taking on different kinds of risks." "But we'd be taking those risks together," Tori pointed out. "And we'd be taking them for the right reasons." 6 months later, Hartwell Security Consulting opened its doors in a renovated warehouse space that combined our marketing agency with Jimmy's investigative services and our new prevention-focused consulting practice. Our first major client was a tech startup whose founder had been approached by investors who reminded me uncomfortably of Elena Vasquez, sophisticated, charming, and eager to rush through due diligence processes. Our investigation revealed that the investors were running a long-term fraud scheme, using legitimate-looking investment funds to gain control of promising companies before stripping their assets and abandoning the businesses. The startup founder had been days away from signing agreements that would have cost him his company and his life savings. "This is exactly why we started this business," Tori said as we reviewed the final report that had saved our client from financial ruin. "To give people the information they need to protect themselves before it's too late." The work was challenging and sometimes emotionally difficult, as it required us to remain constantly alert to the kinds of deception and manipulation we'd experienced personally. But it was also deeply meaningful, knowing that our trauma was being transformed into protection for other families. Dr. Patricia Nguyen had called it post-traumatic growth, the psychological phenomenon where people who survive significant adversity develop greater wisdom, stronger relationships, and a deeper sense of purpose. Our experience with Marcus and Elena had been devastating, but it had also revealed strengths and capabilities we'd never known we possessed. On the second anniversary of Tori's rescue, we held a small celebration at our offices, attended by Jimmy, Patricia, Agent Chen, Mrs. Caldwell, and several clients whose businesses we'd helped protect. It wasn't a celebration of trauma, but rather a recognition of how far we'd traveled from that terrifying October night. 2 years ago, I thought I'd lost everything," I said, raising a glass of champagne as evening light filtered through our office windows. "My marriage was revealed as a fraud, my business was nearly destroyed, my sister was in mortal danger, and I felt like I couldn't trust my own judgment about anything or anyone." I looked around the room at the faces of people who'd become genuine friends and partners, relationships built on honesty and mutual respect rather than hidden agendas. Today, I understand that what I actually lost were illusions that were preventing me from building something real. Marcus wasn't the love of my life. He was a lesson about the difference between charm and character. Elena wasn't an unstoppable criminal mastermind. She was a damaged person who chose to damage others rather than heal herself. Tori stepped beside me, her own glass raised, and we learned that family bonds aren't just vulnerabilities to be exploited. They're also sources of strength that can't be broken by people who don't understand their true value. As our friends applauded and the celebration continued around us, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this moment. Not gratitude for the trauma itself, but for our capacity to transform it into wisdom, purpose, and genuine connections with people who shared our values. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home and Tori and I were cleaning up the remnants of our celebration, I found myself thinking about the woman I'd been 2 years ago. She'd been trusting but not naive, successful but not complete, loved but not truly known. Her life had been comfortable but not entirely authentic, built partly on foundations she hadn't examined closely enough. The woman I'd become was more complex, but more genuine, more cautious but more courageous, more aware of life's dangers but also more appreciative of its possibilities. She'd learned that trust must be earned gradually and proven consistently, that love without honesty was just manipulation, and that true security came not from avoiding all risks, but from building the wisdom and strength to navigate them successfully. "Do you ever miss the simplicity of our old life?" Tori asked as we turned off the office lights and prepared to lock up for the night. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but not enough to go back." That simplicity was based on ignorance about what Marcus was really doing and what Elena was really planning. This complexity is based on knowledge and choice. As we walked to our cars in the parking lot behind our building, I noticed how naturally we both scanned the area for potential threats, how automatically we stayed aware of our surroundings and each other's safety. It wasn't paranoia. It was the kind of practical vigilance that came from understanding how quickly normal life could become dangerous. But I also noticed how easily we laughed together, how comfortable we were in each other's company, how much joy we found in our work and our relationships. Trauma had made us more careful, but it hadn't made us less capable of happiness or connection. "You know what I've been thinking about lately?" Tori said as she unlocked her car. "How to help other people recognize the difference between healthy caution and paralyzing fear. We found that balance, but it took time and work and professional help. Maybe that's our next project," I suggested. Workshops for trauma survivors who want to rebuild their ability to trust without returning to naive vulnerability. It was an idea that excited both of us, another way to transform our experience into service for others who were struggling with similar challenges. As I drove home through the familiar streets of Portland, I reflected on how much our understanding of safety and security had evolved. True safety, I'd learned, didn't come from avoiding all risks or trusting no one. It came from developing the wisdom to evaluate risks accurately, the courage to act on that evaluation, and the strength to recover when things went wrong despite our best efforts. True security wasn't about building walls around our lives, but about building strong foundations within ourselves and our relationships, foundations that could weather storms and support whatever we chose to build upon them. The house that waited for me at the end of my drive was modest compared to the Victorian Marcus, and I had shared, but it was entirely mine, purchased with money I'd earned honestly and decorated according to my own preferences. The garden I'd planted was flourishing, producing vegetables and herbs that nourished my body and flowers that nourished my spirit. Inside, I found a letter waiting on my kitchen table, forwarded from our old address. The return address made my breath catch. It was from Marcus, postmarked from the Federal Correctional Facility where he was serving his sentence. I held the envelope for a long moment, considering whether to open it or simply throw it away. His previous letters had been manipulative attempts to maintain emotional connection and perhaps influence my feelings about his eventual release. But something about this one felt different, heavier somehow. Finally, I opened it and found a single page written in Marcus's familiar handwriting. "Cass," it began, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand why. I also know that apologies are meaningless when they come from someone who caused so much harm. But I wanted you to know that I've spent the past 2 years in therapy, trying to understand how I became the kind of person who could do what I did to you and Tori. I won't burden you with the details of my psychological recovery, but I want you to know that I finally understand the difference between regret and remorse. Regret is wishing you hadn't been caught or hadn't faced consequences. Remorse is understanding the harm you caused and genuinely wishing you could undo it, even if undoing it meant losing everything you thought you wanted. I've heard about your new business and the work you're doing to help other families protect themselves. It doesn't surprise me that you've turned your pain into purpose. It's exactly the kind of person you've always been, even when I was too selfish and manipulative to appreciate it. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I just wanted you to know that the harm I caused you wasn't because of any failure on your part. You loved me honestly and trusted me completely, and I repaid that love and trust with deception and betrayal. That was my choice and my failing, not yours. I hope you found happiness and peace. You deserve both and more than both. Marcus, I read the letter twice, surprised by the absence of self-pity or subtle manipulation that had characterized his previous correspondence. This seemed like a genuine attempt at accountability, though I recognized that even genuine attempts could be strategic. But as I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer where I kept important documents, I realized that it didn't matter whether Marcus's remorse was authentic or performed. What mattered was that I no longer needed his apology to feel complete, or his validation to feel valuable. The woman who'd married him had needed external confirmation of her worth, and had been willing to overlook warning signs to maintain that confirmation. The woman I'd become understood that her value was inherent and non-negotiable, not subject to someone else's recognition or appreciation. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about the future we were building, Tori and I, with Jimmy and Patricia and all the other genuine people who'd entered our lives since the artificial ones had been stripped away. It was a future based on honesty rather than illusion, strength rather than convenience, and love that had been tested by adversity and proven authentic. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. There were clients to serve, businesses to protect, and families to help navigate the complex landscape of trust and security in modern life. There were relationships to nurture, skills to develop, and contributions to make to a world that desperately needed more people willing to choose integrity over expedience. But tonight, for the first time in longer than I could remember, I fell asleep feeling genuinely grateful for the life I was living, the person I'd become, and the future I was actively creating rather than passively accepting. The nightmare was over, the justice was complete, and the real work of living authentically had begun. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.